Now that your knitting machine is all set up and ready, you can start knitting your first test piece. Together, we will knit a small sweater. It is an ideal design and will teach you all the important techniques of machine knitting. This sweater will fit a 4 to 5-year-old child. Illustration 1. Get the orange pattern ruler out of your accessory bag. Illustration 2. Observe the needle scale on the front bed and look for needle number 47 at the right of center. With the orange pattern ruler, move every second needle up by placing the last tooth of the ruler under the needle foot of the 47th needle. Illustration 3. The needle foot is the small part of the needle protruding just above the needle scale. Hold the pattern ruler in a horizontal position and push every second needle up until the hooks of the needles are flush with the upper edge of the front needle bed. If you're not too sure, check again with illustration 3. The needle feet should be approximately 1.5 centimeters or half an inch above the needle scale, and the needle hooks should be even with the upper edge of the needle bed. This is called the working position of the needles. Push another group of needles up into the working position, and the last tooth of the pattern ruler will be placed under needle number 17. Continue with this procedure until needle number 48 at the left of center is pushed up into the working position. Illustration 4. Turn the racking handle in the up position so that it clicks into place. Compare the racking indicator at the top left of the front bed with illustration 5. The black arrow should be between 0 and 1. If necessary, turn the racking handle 1 or 2 full turns to either the right or left until the arrow is in the proper position. Push the same number of needles up on the back bed, always making sure that the needles of that bed are facing the gaps between the needles of the front bed. This prevents a collision of needles when knitting. Look at illustration 6 and check the needles on your knitter. The last needle at the right should be on the back bed, and the last needle at the left should be on the front bed. Adjust your needles if needed and always stick to this rule. Illustration 7 shows very clearly how this needle position is presented in a diagram. A line represents a needle in the working position, and a dot stands for a non-working needle. Illustration 8. Place edge springs on the last needles at the left. Edge springs can be moved sideways by lifting them up and moving across the needle bed. Make sure the latches of the needles are closed before placing the edge springs on them. If you have 2 edge springs on each bed, place the other edge springs on the last working needle at the right. Illustration 9. Look at the trip cam for the row counter. Move it to the left until it touches the left edge spring. Next, we check if the yarn break is correct. Both tension discs must be set to 3.5. 3.5 is an average and goes with most yarns. Higher numbers are meant for very thin yarns and give a stronger tension. Lower numbers give a soft tension for very thick yarns. Now we want to set the lock as needed. Illustration 10. Take the orange strippers from the accessories. The strippers must be fitted into their holders. You'll find these holders at the right and left of the metal part connecting both locks. Illustration 11. From both sides, Insert the strippers by pushing them towards the center of the lock until the small latch clicks into place. To remove the strippers, depress the small white button and pull them out. Illustration 12. For setting the stitch size regulator, it depends on the type of yarn used. The stitch size regulator represents the various sizes of hand knitting needles. Fine needles are used for fine yarns, and thick needles are used for thicker yarns. The same applies to your knitting machine. Illustration 12. On each lock, there is a round stitch size regulator. Turn this dial to 1.5. Adjust the stitch size regulator on the back lock in the same way, i.e., stitch size 1.5. Illustration 13. On both locks, you see a lever that can be moved from N at one end to X on the other end. This lever is called the NX lever. Push it on both locks to N. N position means that normal, as opposed to fancy stitches, will be knitted. Now we want to bring the feeding eyelet with the threaded yarn into the lock. Illustration 14. Pull the lever of the color changer twice to the right. Both feeding eyelets are now up. Illustration 15. Press the feeding eyelet that you want to use first down. Pull the lever of the color changer once to the right. Illustration 16. Press down the second feeding eyelet. Now, you can push the lock to the right far enough to release the lever of the color changer, and the required feeding yarn is automatically brought into the jaws on the lock. Compare with illustration 17 and make sure the feeding eyelet is correctly located in the lock. Only the larger top part should be showing above the jaws. Move the lock slowly from right to left across all needles in the working position. Make sure the lock clears the last needle in the working position by at least 5 centimeters or 2 inches. Illustration 18. The yarn should now form a zigzag going across the gap from one needle to the other. Illustration 19. Next to the stitch size regulator on each lock, there is a dial with letters. This is the pattern selector dial. This dial can only be turned when the NX lever is in the N position. Turn the dial to C on both locks. Illustration 20. Bring the NX lever into the X position on both locks. The X position activates the pattern selector dial. CX is the lock setting for tubular knitting. Illustration 21. Change the stitch size regulator on the front and back locks to 3. Move the lock from left to right, and back to left again. Ensure the lock is always at least 2 inches or 5 centimeters past the last needle in the working position. Illustration 22. Put the NX lever in the N position on both locks. Change the stitch size regulator on both locks to 3.5. Move the lock from left to right. You have just completed your first cast-on for 1x1 borders. This cast-on will not lose its elasticity. Illustration 23. Return the row counter on the lock to 0 by pulling a small lever to the right. Now you may go ahead and knit. Use even and regular movements to push the lock across the needles. Move the lock 1 to 2 inches or 5 centimeters approximately beyond the edge of the knitting. Each movement of the lock across the needle equals 1 knitted row. Stop when the row counter indicates 22. Take the yarn out of the yarn clip at the right of the front bed. The lock is at right. When casting on or starting a new stitch pattern, the lock must be at the right position unless otherwise indicated. You have now knitted a 1x1 rib band. To continue in plain stocking stitch, all stitches have to be transferred to the front bed. At the front and back, place an edge spring onto the adjacent empty needle. Illustration 24. Take the double-decker tool out of your accessory bag. This is a needle with an eye on each end. Illustration 25. Place an eyelet of the double-decker tool on the needle head, holding the first stitch at the right on the back bed. Illustration 26. Pull the needle upwards until the stitch lies beyond the open latch. Illustration 27. With the help of the double-decker tool, push the needle back as far as possible, and the stitch will slip over the closed latch onto the double-decker tool. Illustration 28. Lift the double-decker tool off the needle. On the front bed just opposite, there is an empty needle. Illustration 29. Insert the other eye of the double-decker tool into the head of this empty needle on the front bed by tilting the tool forward. Pull the needle upwards to the same position as the adjacent needle with a stitch on it. Illustration 30. Tilt the double-decker tool forward, and the more you tilt, the easier the stitch slips off the tool and onto the knitting needle of your machine. Repeat this procedure with all stitches on the back bed until all stitches are transferred to the front bed. Check your work with the illustrations. Now all the stitches are hanging on the needles of the front bed, and there are none on the back bed needles. Illustration 31 shows you how this needle arrangement is illustrated on a diagram. The horizontal line symbolizes the gap between the front and back bed. The vertical lines below the horizontal line symbolize the needles in the working position. Above the horizontal line, you will see dots symbolizing needles in the non-working position. With a straight edge of the pattern ruler, push all needles of the back bed down into the non-working position. Illustration 32. Set the back lock as follows. Turn the pattern selector dial to G and push the NX lever to X. This lock setting ensures that when the back lock moves, the needles will not knit. The racking handle should be in the down position. On the front bed, set an edge spring on the last knitting needle with a stitch on it. Make sure the needle latch is closed when you place the edge spring on it. Illustration 33. Look for the black strippers in your accessories. For knitting stocking stitch, the orange strippers have to be replaced by the black strippers. To remove the orange strippers, depress the small white button and pull them out. Then, insert the black strippers. Illustration 34. On the front lock, set the stitch size regulator to 6. Return the row counter to 0 by pulling the small lever to the right. Illustration 35. Knit stocking stitch until the row counter reads 76. Return the row counter to 0. Our next knitting technique will be the armhole shaping. decreasing is always done on the side where the lock is. First, we want to decrease 4 stitches. Therefore, place an edge spring onto the adjacent empty needle. Leave it there as long as you are decreasing stitches. Illustration 36. Get the orange tool out. Hold it like a pencil, with the eye being the tip. Put the first stitch on the lock side on this tool. Illustration 37. To do this, proceed as for transferring stitches from the back to front bed. Place the eye of the orange tool on the needle that holds the first stitch. Illustration 38. Pull the needle up until the stitch is behind the latch. Illustration 39. With the orange tool, push the needle down as far as possible. The needle latch will close, and the stitch will slip onto the orange tool. Illustration 40. Unhook the orange tool, being careful not to drop the stitch. Illustration 41. Insert the eyelet of the orange tool into the needle head of the adjacent needle at the left. Illustration 42. Place the stitch onto this needle by tilting the tool forward. It is easier if you slightly pull the knitting from below with your left hand. The orange tool is now empty. Push the empty needle at the right out of the working position. There are 2 stitches on the last needle at the right. Push the foot of this needle up so that both stitches will be behind the open latch. Illustration 43. Wind the yarn you have been knitting with twice around the needle so that it lies once behind the latch and once in front of it. Illustration 44. Hold this needle down until the 2 stitches slide over the closed latch, creating a new stitch. Pull this needle further down to make the newly formed stitch a little bit bigger. It is important to pull this stitch to obtain a loose cast-off. Continue to decrease in the same way, placing this new stitch onto the next needle to the left. Knit that double stitch, and go on to the next until you have decreased 4 stitches in total. Illustration 45. Pull down the knitting yarn behind the tension disc and from under the yarn guide, preventing surplus yarn between the lock and the knitting. Push the lock to the left and decrease 4 stitches in the same manner on the left. Be careful not to forget to push all the empty needles out of the working position. Otherwise, new stitches will be cast onto those needles. Push the lock to the right and decrease 3 stitches on the right. Push the lock to the left and decrease 3 stitches on the left. Move the lock to the right and decrease 2 stitches. Move the lock to the left and decrease 2 more stitches. Move the lock to the right and decrease 1 stitch. Move the lock to the left and decrease 1 stitch on the left. Push the lock to the right and decrease 1 stitch. Move the lock to the left and decrease 1 stitch. Move the lock to the right and decrease 1 stitch. Move the lock to the left and decrease 1 more stitch. Now the armhole shaping is completed. The row counter reads 11. Replace the edge springs on the outer needles. Illustration 46 shows you the complete armhole shaping with the number of stitches you have decreased. Illustration 47. Continue to knit straight up to the 52nd row. Note, check your yarn. If it's nearly all gone, find the end of the ball and knot it together with the beginning of the next ball or cone. Illustration 48. When you notice this knot coming through the tension disc, stop the lock at the left or right of knitting. Use the latch needle from your accessories, hold the yarn, and pull it down between the beds until you grab this knot. Hold the knot with one hand, and with the other hand, move the lock across the needles. After one row, let the yarn go. When the row counter reads 52, you will start the shoulder shaping. Return the row counter to 0. Illustration 49. At the right where the lock is, decrease 3 stitches after removing the edge spring. Move the lock to the left and decrease 3 stitches on the left. Move the lock to the right and decrease another 3 stitches. Continue to decrease 3 stitches on both sides until 36 stitches remain. Knit one more row. The row counter reads 12. Stop the lock and cast off the remaining 36 stitches. Casting off is the same procedure as decreasing for the armhole and shoulder shaping. Before you cast off the last stitch, switch on this tape. Illustration 50. Pull plenty of yarn from the feeding eyelet, then break the yarn. Illustration 51. Firmly hold the end of the yarn that is coming from the feeding eyelet. Path it between the 2 beds and fix it in the yarn clip at the right on the front bed. Illustration 52. Finally, pull the loose end of yarn through the last stitch and take the knitting from the machine. Illustration 53. The back of your sweater is now completed. If you want, you can continue to the next part, which will be the front. The lock is at right now. Now, press the key for fast forward on your player to the end of the tape and turn it over. To knit the front, please have a close look at the illustration 54. This is the pattern for the front. The number 96 at the bottom indicates the number of stitches to be cast on. Use the needle scale as a guide and push 48 needles at the right and 48 needles at the left to center both back and front into the working position. Refer back to illustration 7 for the correct needle setting for a 1x1 cast on. Turn the racking handle up and push every alternate needle, back and front, out of work. Compare once more with illustration 7. Ensure that no needle in the working position faces another needle in the working position. Illustration 8. Set the edge springs onto closed latch needles. Push the trip cam to the left until it touches the edge spring. Illustration 13. Turn the stitch size regulator on both locks to 1.5 and push the NX lever to the end position. Knit one row. Illustration 21. Turn the pattern selector dial to C and the NX lever to X. Turn the stitch size regulator to 3. Knit 2 rows. Illustration 22. Push the NX lever to the N position and change the stitch size to 3.5. Knit 1 row. Return the row counter to 0. Knit 22 rows. Transfer all stitches from the back bed to the front bed. Push all needles on the back bed out of the working position. Set the back lock to GX. Insert black strippers. Set the stitch size regulator to 6 on the front lock. Knit the 76 rows straight in stocking stitch. Return the row counter to 0. Now you can start shaping the armhole in the same manner as you did for the back. For detailed instructions, see illustration 54. In the illustration, you will find all the necessary information regarding rows and stitches for the armhole shaping. The numbers indicated as -4, -3, -2, and 3 times -1 represent the number of stitches to be decreased. The dot followed by the number 2 and the capital R stands for rows. The dot could also indicate every, meaning to decrease in every second row or every alternate row. Refer back to illustration 46 for a more detailed description. Once the armhole shaping is finished, continue to knit straight until the row counter reads 34. At this point, you will start the neck shaping. Return the row counter to 0. Take a 25 cm or 10-inch strand of wool from an identical ball of wool. The diagram on illustration 54 instructs you to cast off the center 8 stitches. Therefore, place the 4th stitch at the right of the center onto the 3rd needle at the right of the center. Illustration 57. Cast off these 2 stitches with the prepared strand of wool. Place this new stitch onto the adjacent left needle, and so forth, until 8 stitches are cast off at the center of your knitting. Pass the strand down between the 2 beds. Illustration 58. For every needle at the right of the cast-off 8 stitches, put the respective pushers into the working position. Illustration 59. The pushers are in the blocking rail at the lower edge of each needle bed. This blocking rail has a release knob at its left side. With your left hand, open the blocking rail of the front bed by pushing this knob to the right and holding it there. With your right hand, bring the pushers into the working position by pushing them upward. If they are difficult to move, oil them as you have oiled the needles. Illustration 60. Bring the same number of pushers into the working position as you have working needles. Release the button, and the rail will close automatically. Illustration 61. Important. If a pusher gets caught in the upper half of the blocking rail, it will not close properly, resulting in faulty knitting later on. Move the pushers up until they touch the needle feet. In this position, the feet of the pushers are approximately 1.5 centimeters or half an inch away from the blocking rail. Illustration 62. turn the pattern selector dial of the front lock to B and the NX lever to position X. Note that the pattern selector dial is only adjustable when the NX lever is on N. It does not work if the NX lever is set to X, regardless of its setting. Turn the pattern selector dial before setting the NX lever to X. Knit one row. Even though you are knitting on the right half of the needle bed, you have to move the lock across all needles and the trip cam for the row counter. If the trip cam is too far left, you may move it closer to the handle. Carefully study the information on neck shaping in illustration 54. To make it easier, a more detailed pattern is provided in illustration 63. The vertical line represents the center of your knitting. Next, you have to cast off 4 stitches. Push the 4 empty needles and the corresponding pushers out of work into the so-called rest position, where the pusher's feet are touching the blocking rail. When knitting with pushers, remember to push empty needles and corresponding pushers out of work. Knit 2 rows. Continue to decrease according to illustration 63, marking each decrease on the pattern. Knit until the row counter reads 18. Now let's start decreasing for the shoulder shaping. According to the pattern on illustration 54, the following information applies. Decrease 3 stitches every alternate row, 6 times. On illustration 64, you can mark each decrease. Always remember to push empty needles and pushers out of work as you go along. Illustration 65. The first half is completed. Hopefully, you fixed the yarn in the clip at the right of the front bed to prevent the yarn from slipping out of the feeding eyelet. If the yarn has slipped through the feeding eyelet, thread it again as shown in your instruction book. Return all pushers back into the blocking rail. Pull the knob to the right with your left hand, and with your right hand, push the pushers down. Put the feeding yarn into the jaw on the lock. Return the row counter to 0. Set the NX lever to the N position. Knit 2 rows. Illustration 66. Decrease for neck shaping. Here, the neck shaping is on the right-hand side of the knitting, while the shoulder shaping that started in the 18th row is on the left-hand side. After finishing the cast-off, remember to push all needles and pushers down and move the lock to the right side of the needle bed. Now, we will proceed to knit your first sleeve. Illustration 67. Cast on 50 stitches for a 1x1 rib, as you did for the back and front parts. Again, use the needle scale as your guide. On the front and back bed, bring every alternate needle between needle 25 at the right and needle 25 at the left into the working position. You now have 25 needles in the working position on each bed. Compare with illustration 7. With the lock set to N, and stitch size 1.5, knit 1 row. With lock set to CX and stitch size 3, knit 2 rows. Set the locks to N, and with stitch size 3.5, knit 1 row. Return the row counter to 0. Illustration 68. Knit 20 rows in 1 by 1 rib for the ribbed cuff. Illustration 69. Transfer all stitches to the front bed for stocking stitch. Don't forget to push the needles of the back bed out of work. At the same time, set the back lock to GX and turn the racking handle down. Remove the orange strippers and replace them with the black strippers. Change the stitch size to 6. Return the row counter to 0. Consult illustration 67 for the next increases concerning the fullness of the sleeve. Plus, 10 times 1 stitch every 8th row. Therefore, knit 8 rows. We will increase the stocking stitch knitting on the same side as the lock is. Illustration 70. Push the adjacent empty needle into the working position. Knit 1 row. Push the adjacent empty needle at the left into the working position. By now, you have increased your knitting by 2 stitches. Continue to knit until the row counter reads 16. On the lock side, push the adjacent empty needle into the working position. Knit 1 row and increase 1 stitch at the left by pushing the adjacent needle into the working position. Knit another 7 rows and repeat this increase at the right and left. Continue to increase 8 times every 8th row. An additional help is illustration 71. There you can mark each increase as you knit. When you have finished increasing, you will have knitted 82 rows. Continue to knit until the row counter reads 96. Return the row counter to 0. This is where the shaping of the sleeve top starts. Consult illustration 67, -3 stitches, -18 times 1 stitch, -twice 3 stitches every alternate row. Follow diagram 72 and mark decreases after each and every row. Have you finished decreasing? The row counter should read 42. There are 16 stitches left on the needles of your knitter. Cast off these remaining 16 stitches. Knit the second sleeve in exactly the same way, using illustrations 71 and 72 for assistance. You may rewind the tape and listen again if needed. The second sleeve is finished. If you like, we may pin out all the parts to size and lightly press them, as shown in illustration 73. Sew up the loose strands of yarn. Then, make up the sweater by joining the side and sleeve seams. In your instruction book, you will find useful hints for finishing garments. Join the side and sleeve seams with mattress stitch. Use backstitch for the shoulder seam and setting in sleeve. Illustration 74. Measure the neck edge of your sweater. If it seems a little bit too large, you can always ease it in, but not too much, as it still must fit over a child's head. Illustration 75. Stretch the 1 by 1 ribbed sideways and compare it with the neckband measurements. Count the stitches needed for the neckband. Cast on this number of stitches in the 1 by 1 rib. See illustration 76 for details. Do you remember? You will insert the orange strippers and set the stitch size to 3.5. Knit 14 rows. Illustration 77. Transfer all stitches to the front bed for stocking stitch. Insert black strippers for stocking stitch and increase the stitch size to 6. Knit 2 more rows. Then, change to a different colored yarn. You may use any yarn you have on hand, making sure it is about the same weight. Thread this yarn through the second yarn tension and into the second feeding eyelet. Make sure the position of the feeding eyelet holders remains unchanged. Change the color by pushing the lock to the far right. The feeding eyelets will interchange automatically when the lock operates the lever of the color changer. When changing the color in this way, make sure that only an empty feeding eyelet holder is up. The eyelet holder with the feeding eyelet in it must be down when pushing the lock into the color changer unit. Knit a few rows with this contrasting yarn. Illustration 78. Push the lock as far as possible to the right and leave it there. Press down the second feeding eyelet that came up so that there will be no feeding eyelet in the lock. With the empty lock that holds no feeding eyelet, move across the knitting. The knitting will drop off. Illustration 79. Press only the stocking stitch edge of the finished neckband to avoid drop stitches when you sew the neckband to the neck edge of the sweater. Don't press the 1x1 rib part of the neckband so it will keep its elasticity. Unravel all rows of contrast or waste yarn. Pin the neckband to the outside neck edge. Illustration 80. Attach the neckband stitch by stitch with backstitch, unraveling the last row of stocking stitch as you go. Join the narrow edges of the neckband. The sweater is finished. It's the first creation you have achieved on your knitting machine. Pay no attention to the time it took to knit it. Gained experience and final success is all that matters.